Good afternoon, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have a great discussion today on allyship. It's our session for International Women's Day, and we've decided not to focus on the women in sport community specifically, but actually focus on inclusivity and environment. And one of the things that has repeatedly come up is the topic of allyship. So before we do that, I'm just going to let you introduce yourselves, if that's okay. And Lauren, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, so lovely, really excited about this call, lovely to be here. I'm Lauren, and I'm the new business and marketing lead for Octagon, who's a creative agency in sport.
Thank you. And Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz Johnson. I'm a Paralympic swimming champion and co-founder of The Ability People, which is an organisation that consults on normalising differences within the workplace that leads to authentic inclusion.
And James?
James Swanson, manager of customer experience at Harlequins, which is a rugby club based in southwest London.
Thank you. And James, do you want to just start by sharing a little bit about the work you've been doing recently with regards to the supporters community?
Yes, so last month was LGBT History Month, and a year on from our inaugural LGBTQ+ Pride Game, we were delighted to announce the first LGBTQ+ Supporters Association in rugby globally. For us, it was a natural next step, very much part of our legacy in regards to diversity and inclusion, and I guess a recognition of how diverse our fan base is, but equally ensuring that we're providing a voice to our supporters. And it's very much part of our authentic commitment, but very much integrating it into the fabric of the club.
That's great. So James, if I was to say to you, what does allyship look and feel like? What would you say to that?
For me, I think allyship, stems a lot from understanding, being aware, asking questions, and being a champion for all facets of equality, diversity, inclusion, and not being afraid to challenge other people's behavior, and just being that advocate, whether you represent that group or not. You know, ultimately an inclusive society will benefit us all, and I think that's the role of what an ally is.
That's great. And Liz, how would you describe that if you're going into an organisation and trying to drive an inclusive environment?
I think I'd add to what James said, because he said some really good stuff, is that like that metaphorically you're standing with people, you're using your voice to help them, to promote their needs if they maybe aren't in a position to be heard. So use your platform, use your experiences, not just to stand by and not actively engage with negativity, but actively engage with dispelling those myths and helping people move forward and make progress. I think for me, it's about giving people opportunities and using your position, if you can, to help them make that happen.
What do you think that looks like tangibly on a day-to-day? So say I'm within an organisation, I'm thinking, how can I be a better ally? What would be the kind of scenario that you would expect someone to step forward?
I think it's, for example, when people get overlooked. So they're like, oh, we won't bother asking James's opinion because he's likely not going to know. Whereas I, as then Liz, go, no, actually, I know James has got an opinion here. So as James's ally, I go, I think James has got something really good to add to this conversation. Or if someone comes to me and says, you know, we're looking for someone to do this piece of work, I'll be like, oh, James has definitely got those skills. I've seen it before. So actually putting other people forward and using your position, your voice, if you know, and I think I find myself in that position a lot. I know that people will give me the opportunity. Like sometimes it is because I was a Paralympian, sometimes it is because I've won a gold medal, whatever, but it would be amiss of me not to utilize that, recognize that, and use that to help others. And I think that's what it looks like in real life, in a tangible situation, is not sitting back and not agreeing with something, but actively encouraging people to correct their behavior.
And Lauren, I guess coming to you, working in a more sort of traditional corporate environment, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, massively. Yeah, totally agree with what the guys have said, obviously. But to Liz's point, it's being active in that. So it's the unwritten rule of having people's back. And when, say, one of us isn't in the meeting room or in the conversation, it's bringing that person in and really creating space for for those people. So, you know, like you said, recommending their expertise, or, you know, even on a Teams call or a meeting that's going on, and you can see someone's been overlooked slightly, or maybe they've missed their chance to speak, or it can be something as simple as that, where the ally would just go, oh, hang on, was it something you had to say, Laura? Or was it, I think we maybe skipped past that point, but I know you've got something to say. You know, it's just creating space for other people. And in doing that, sometimes it's, you know, giving up the space as well. So putting yourself back to push someone else forward. And that takes a lot of confidence, but, you know, you've really got to walk the walk now. You can't just say I'm an ally and do nothing. You have to really step forward. So yes, to that point, totally agree. And being active in that, doing something.
That's really interesting. And can anyone offer up a story, a sort of real life story of where they've seen allyship play out in a really positive way? I think that would really help it kind of crystallize in people's mind.
I think, like, I can go if you want, if no one else wants to go at this point. I think in my world, I think it happens a lot, because we were talking before the call started about how people sometimes, when they're looking at inclusion and equity and diversity, they'll target certain groups at certain times in positive ways, but they'll say we're going to work on a certain demographic to increase the numbers. But I think disability is the one area that's the most misunderstood, because, and I say that because, like, for example, nobody bats an eyelid if a person with a disability doesn't have a job. They just assume that they weren't capable of getting that job, or they weren't or if they haven't been to university, they will assume it was because they weren't clever enough to go to university. Like, so that's what I mean when I say it's one of the most misunderstood, not in terms of the way that they have to live and what they're up against, but just in terms of what it actually means to have a disability. Like, people seem to not understand that so much. So I find a lot of the time when we're in our day-to-day work, and I found it with members of my team that didn't go to university or do have quite a significant impairment, people don't give them the voice. So quite often we'll have had the conversation before we go into a meeting, and I know that person is completely capable. So I'm like, oh yeah, I think that person, well, I don't need to say their name, but like, that person's got something to say, and then they go and they absolutely smash it out of the park, and people are like, their jaws drop to the floor for the fact that somebody who maybe doesn't have use of their legs or use of their arms or full sight can have such an opinion, and it be so profound and so important. So I think, again, I try to use the allyship every day in what we do now, but I think I got it from the fact that when I was younger and I was swimming, I was on the other side of it. I needed people who maybe weren't as good a swimmer as I was, didn't have as much potential as I did, but were able-bodied. I needed them to get the coach to notice me. So I know it can work. I appreciate that it worked, and I'm still friends with those people now, but I just know what a difference it made to the opportunities that then opened up for me. So I think that's what I try to do now, because if it hadn't been for those people going, actually, no, Liz should come to this dinner too. Like, if they're having a social, because I didn't swim in their group because I wasn't fast enough, then people would think that I didn't need to be socially involved with people my own age. So I'll always be really grateful for that allyship that I got, even 25 years ago, when it wasn't so formalized and it wasn't the buzzword, but that's exactly what was happening. So now I feel like I'm in that position to be able to do that for the next generation.
Yeah, it's a really good. I'm sorry.
Go on, Lauren. Go on.
It's something that I'm aware of as well personally, in terms of, I guess, good allyship, but just a watch out for each other. Like, I think we've got blind spots when it comes to diversity and inclusion and allyship and as a whole, because, for me, being quite honest, I'm female, I'm mixed race as black, so BAME. So for me, my blinkers are really, I'm open to that. I get it, gender, diversity, that's me. Reel me in, I'll talk about it all the time. But when, being honest, not having loads of people with a disability in my network, in my world, you have to be very aware of your own blind spots, and especially within a company, within an organization. To Liz's point, you can really focus in on one or two aspects of diversity or inclusion and completely forget about the rest. And you have to make sure that you've got a wide enough view. And some people in my agency and people I've worked with are great at that. So they have that kind of wider angle of really bringing other people in and making sure, other aspects and experiences are considered. And potentially with allyship, an example I've had in previous roles in my previous organisation was I was put forward for a panel actually, and I was so excited to be part of this panel. I was very casual about it. I was like, this is great. I'm just gonna have a speaking opportunity. But what that person did is not only did they recommend me for the panel, so I got the opportunity, they also then mentored me for the next week or so about how to really be effective on a panel, right? Instead of just come in willy-nilly, it's an informal chat. They're like, no, you know, you need to be a bit more prepared and really kind of saw it through. So yeah, that's just a personal experience, but definitely agree with what you've been saying.
Yeah, and I think what you both speak about there, which I find interesting, is you're not speaking about allyship. We often talk about it as if it's akin to white men only, I guess is what I've got in my mind. You know, that allyship is not necessarily looking to the white middle-aged man in the room to be the ally. You're talking about it in lots of different contexts and in lots of different environments. So that strikes me as something that it would be a good takeaway for people, is that, to your point, Laura, know your blind spots. You know, I'm a woman, I'm very conscious of probably gender bias. Am I as conscious naturally? Probably not, you know, in all honesty. So that is an interesting point. James, what about yourself? Can you think of any? I know that you've worked in the US as well, so I'd be interested to know if there's a comparison there at all.
Yeah, I had a think about this question. I think that you know, in relation to what you just said there about who we view these sort of allies who need to be, I mean, I think of the relationships I built internally at Harlequins in regards to building the game initially, and someone who maybe internally I can speak to. You know, I think of Mark Leckie, the head of our foundation, who I would describe as an LGBTQ plus ally. He does represent as a cisgendered heterosexual man, but equally he understands what holistic commitment looks like in regards to diversity and inclusion. And, you know, when building the game, and he was one of the senior management team that I worked with extensively, talking through what that looks like in regards to holistic delivery. And, you know, through working with him, the foundation partnered with Monash University to do grassroots research into homophobic and sexist language affecting men's and women's teams in Southwest London, as very much sort of that grassroots commitment to understanding how this topic impacts all parts of the rugby landscape. So through, again, conversations and working with him, you know, he made that happen. And I think to a conversation I had last week, you notice I have my gender pronouns in my Zoom profile. I was talking to him why I do that. And initially, he wasn't aware. I explained it. He then went away, did his own research, and on my next call with him, he had his gender pronouns listed because he understood the reasons behind it and how impactful it can be. So when I think to allyship, I think of, again, you know, asking those questions, understanding what commitment looks like, but also doing your own research to make sure that you are as informed as you can be.
That's a great opportunity, James. I would love it if you can explain why you have your gender pronouns on your Zoom profile.
Yeah, you know, I think it's something which, you know, is very important when we talk about inclusion as a whole and understanding gender identity and having that conversation. You know, as a cisgendered male, no one's ever questioned my gender identity, and I view that as a privilege and something we don't really talk about. But for me, you know, it's important to recognize I've never been questioned about my gender identity, and I've never been concerned about how someone might identify me. But that's not the case for everyone. For those who are non-binary, for those who are transgendered, and I think that by listing your profile, your pronouns, you're starting that dialogue, you're having that conversation, but equally you're very explicitly saying, you know, this is how I identify, to make sure that there's never sort of any ambiguity. And again, I just think it's about understanding as cisgendered people the role that gender identity plays in society.
It's almost like a signal, isn't it? Like a, I don't know, like it's an easy ally win if you want to, not just badging yourself, but you know, it's a little nugget to start a conversation, isn't it? And I think that's where a lot of these conversations fall down, is people maybe don't know what to say, or if they're going to offend someone, or just having the conversation is the starting point to everything, right? So
absolutely, yeah. Starting the conversation, and that does lead nicely when you're talking about inclusive environment. I wanted to just talk a little bit about inclusive environment and what that looks and feels like to you. And Liz, maybe I'll come to you because I know that's something that you feel passionate about.
Yeah, for me, an inclusive environment is looking at removing any unnecessary barriers. So focus, if you're in a situation, focusing on the objective of that situation, and then anything that isn't directly necessary to achieve that objective, remove it. So I think, because so often, again, and it goes back to Lauren's idea of having blind spots, like if it's never applied to you, then the chances are you've never noticed that it's not there, or that it is there and it gets in the way, because you can navigate it your own way and it's not an obstacle for you. But again, having that awareness that it's not a one size fits all policy. And I think we've learned that, or more people's attention has been drawn to that in the last year than ever before, because I think when we were trying to, not anymore because we've moved so far away from what the world used to look like, that we are living in a very different way now. But in the beginning, what people were trying to do was to maintain that normality as much as possible. And so they just put in fixes that would enable people to keep existing as they had, but with the new guidelines. But what that did was excluded so many people. And I think one easy example to use is when they decide they're going to pedestrianize high streets. I get it. I get why you're trying to cut down the traffic, but then they put bollards in that are of a certain width, that then certain people, not everybody who's mobility impaired uses a standardized wheelchair, or not everyone who cycles uses a two-wheel bicycle. And actually, but all that it does, a lot of the time when we're looking to create inclusive environments, people are worried about cost and time, and resource. But actually, when you get it wrong in the beginning instance, then you just have to make adjustments or undo all your good work. And well, it wasn't good work, that's why you've got to undo it, and then put in the correct whether it be the facilities, whether it be the actual physical elements of it, or actually just processes. So it's key when you're having an inclusive environment to have representation at every level for accessibility. And that isn't, like I said, it's not just about wheelchair users. It is about people who are non-binary, or it is about people who are living different cultural lives and have different needs, and actually represent. And even if you don't have someone in your organization at the time that you think needs that, you don't actually know everything. You don't know everything about everyone, because they shouldn't have to tell you everything about themselves. No one person should have to disclose any more than the peer next to them to be able to access the same opportunity. And I think if you start to look at it that way, that's when you start to become more aware of the blockers that are in place and the barriers that exist. And again, to Lauren's point about the blind spots, we all have them, because you can't be you can't know everything. But to James's point about being willing to talk about things, and just knowing that actually your way is not necessarily the best way. It might be the best way for you, but that doesn't mean that there isn't another way to get the same job done.
Very well articulated, thank you. James, what does an inclusive, when you think about an inclusive environment, what does that look and feel like to you?
For me, and we've touched on this already, it's about having diversity of thought, having having representative voices at the right levels. It's about asking the right questions, being willing to learn. And I think, what Liz just said there, it struck me about a conversation I had about accessibility this morning, as organizations being maybe too concerned to ask out of maybe getting feedback that they can't action, and then feeling, oh, well, then it's going to be worse because we're ignoring the feedback. Number one, it's always best to ask. And while there might be, you identify a significant accessibility challenge at your venue, perhaps, I think there could be small steps to make it 10, 20% better. There's always going to be steps you can do to make that experience that you don't have a little bit better, but by not asking, you're never going to know. So I think an inclusive environment as well outside of that is making sure that, I've used the term holistic already, but all stages of an employee journey is also with that in mind. I talk about recruitment in sports, and the impact that has on diversity and inclusion. Nepotism has been a word that's been thrown at the industry in the past, and the way in which networks are used to support certain applications in. And, while I get that, equally, it sort of prohibits certain groups from accessing, coming into the marketplace. And again, if you're not getting that diversity of thought in the organization, you're never going to be able to make progress, because again, if you don't have the lived experience, you're not going to know. So I think it's the full circle of what that looks like.
That's really interesting, and the point around recruitment has come up repeatedly, actually, in terms of, that does seem to be a particular challenge with the sports industry, is the kind of the way in which talent comes into the industry. Lauren, when you think about your world within sort of agency world, what do you think of in terms of trying to drive an inclusive environment?
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky one. It's a tricky one, and it's not where it needs to be at the moment. Absolutely. And I think, again, echoing the brilliant points Liz and James have already made, I think it's having a real commitment to, seeking to understand as an agency, as an organisation. We can't crack it just internally with the people that we have right now. Like, there's some good ideas, there's people, but you want to make sure that working group is considered, and you've got a nice wide range of opinions and experiences. So I think really taking the time to seek to understand and really dedicating that time, committing to that time to do that. To James's point, always ask, having the commitment to ask the question. And I think it comes back, personally for me, I see it as a theme around diversity and inclusion. It's fear of saying the wrong thing or offending, and we're all human. I get it all the time. Like, it's the same thing, but it's better to ask, and you just swallow your own embarrassment. Like, it's not about you. Just put it out there. It's got good intentions, and hopefully then you'll get to a good, a better point than where you were. And I think as an organisation, thinking even personally, it's just really seeking to understand, asking the question, be bold, and make the time to really understand different perspectives at the start of a project, at the start of the year, at the start of a month, whatever it is. Really dedicate that time to gain new knowledge and think about other people.
Thank you. And there's understandably at the moment, I sense a real urgency around action, specifically in the sort of last 12 months. And maybe a question for you, Liz, because you work with organisations in that capacity. What does good progress look like? Because there is this thing of like, it's not going to happen overnight in terms of building an entirely inclusive environment. But what can I expect of, if I'm a leader within an organisation, what can I expect good to look like a week from now, a month from now, 12 months from now?
I think good progress starts with awareness and increased awareness, and actually putting it on the agenda so that it's not a choice. It's a responsibility. And actually, I think and when we talk about inclusion and equity and diversity, actually so often it's like, oh yeah, we'll get to that, but it's not in the budget for this year, or it's on our agenda, but we've got to deal with the fact that now no one's working in the office and we don't know what we're doing, and we got to get new resources. Like, no, but if you don't understand, if you're inclusive and you make everything equitable, you'll actually solve these problems more quickly, because you'll have that, like James was saying, that diversity of mind, that diversity of experience, that means we don't all get stuck at the same problem. So I think the first thing is increased awareness, because you organically move forward, and holistically, it's not one person in the organization's responsibility. It's not HR's responsibility to deal with difference. It needs to become embedded. So just making those small steps, and sometimes the smallest steps have the biggest results, because often organizations are concerned that the disclosure rate isn't where it needs to be. And that whole thing around disclosing whether you're different or not in some way is a bit of a catch-22, because you want people to disclose so you can assess how well you're doing at creating an inclusive environment. But then you want to create an inclusive environment where people don't have to disclose. So it's a really difficult situation to be in. But what you notice is people become more relaxed and more comfortable and more effective in their position, because they're able to be themselves. And I think so that the biggest and easiest step to make is to stop talking about it and start doing something about it. And I think in terms of allyship, that's the difference between being a supporter of a good idea and actually helping things progress. And you're right, Lauren, things aren't going to happen overnight, but certain things can. like even conversations that we've all had here now, we'll go away from it and remember them. And so that's a progression that when we speak to the next person, we'll know something that we didn't know yesterday. And so I think that's the measure of it, and that's how you move forward. But I think the biggest thing I would say that you have to make it a priority and realize it's a responsibility, not something that we're going to get to eventually.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So it's all, time's flown by, but I want to finish off by asking you all kind of to paint a picture of the future 10 years from now, sports industry, professional sports industry, off the field, so not necessarily talking about on the field athletes and talent. Where would you like, what does it look and feel like? What would you hope it's like, James?
I think for me, I mean, we've used all these terms thus far, and I think it's important. Again, we talked about diversity of thought, we talked about, diversity in all senses, but I think you have organizations that have different people at different levels with also different job functions who don't always represent certain characteristics, and not just sort of streamlined down into one path because you happen to represent something. I think it's important that we have different people at all different levels and different functions, and certain people from certain groups aren't viewed as being effective in just one area. It's about, and again, it's that sort of circle piece of, once we move forward with sort of inclusive recruitment, having the conversation internally, recognizing the difference between the back office and on the field. I think so often in sports, we focus so much about getting diversity in the team or maybe in the coaching side, and we sort of neglect what happens in the back offices, where sort of the club strategy and the business side tends to happen. Is we need to make sure it's reflective, our sport is representative, and it's also not disproportionately represented in certain areas either. So I guess, we've talked about its continued discussion, it's inclusivity at the center, and its continued dialogue. But sort of for me, that's how I think I'd like to see the industry progress in the next 10 years.
Thank you. And Lauren, maybe I'll come to you.
I think for me, just in 10 years, that's a long time. So I hope a lot of changes happen. But in essence, for me, just better, not perfect. Like, I think people and organisations are sometimes, crippled by the fear of getting things perfect and exactly right until they, put stuff out there or pledges out there, make a real stand or change policies or whatever it might be, have conversations even. I see that quite regularly. People are just scared to, again, like my earlier point, again, saying the wrong thing. But I think, just be better. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just do something so you're moving in the right direction. And that's a call to action for all of us. And yeah, just alleviate yourself of fear. There's enough organisations out there, brilliant people like Liz, James, Laura, you as well, and everything that you put out with leaders. You can have good conversations to educate yourselves quickly. So yeah, in 10 years, different to what it is. And to James' point, on the field, but also off the field and in organisations, not just in roles, the doing roles and the managerial levels and executive levels. It's really at the C-suites that we need to start seeing that diversity reflected, to really create that inclusive culture, to be honest, because you need to buy it at the top to really sell it in at the bottom. So, yeah.
And Liz, what about you?
Well, I think just to add to the great things that James and Lauren have already said, it's just, for me, it's about we'd almost, in 10 years, you'd hope that you'd be blind to difference. We wouldn't have to keep having campaigns or reading about like really unjust situations to get people's attention. And ultimately, like we all know it, sport has the power to change the world, and everybody can relate to sport in some way, which is what makes it such an amazing tool. But you really got to be able to see it to believe it. And like Laura said, like James said, in every element of sport is like, yes, you've got your on the field of play athletes, but actually there's so much more to it. Sport is a business. Sport is, even if it's an event, like that's an organization, it's a business. So there's plenty of opportunity for plenty of representation. And like actually through making the right noises and the right movements and supporting the right people, we can enable people to access things equitably, so that people watching at home, all different types of people watch sport, they want to be able to see themselves represented in that arena, whether it's the stewards, whether it's the broadcasting team, but I think what we want to move away from is this idea that actually someone's only there for tokenism. So it becomes so normalized that people can just be appreciated, because 10 years, like Lauren said, it is a long time, but in certain demographics, not enough or not a lot changes in those 10 years. So I think for that to happen, we want to move away from it being, that one person that everybody knows, or that one person that can get abused because they're there, but they're not abused because they said a bad comment about somebody. They're abused because of what they're wearing or how they spoke. So actually, let's make it normal to be different, so that we become blind to it and it is everywhere. And I think only then, when we're no longer having to have these conversations about what needs to be done and why it's wrong, only when we're having these conversations about how many amazing people we know that are getting to do jobs that they love, in sport or just generally, or not having to exhale all the time because they've been treated poorly, or they've gone to do something and then realize it's not going to be possible. That's ultimately where we want to get to. And 10 years is a long time, so it is possible, because I think now conversations like this and people realizing that action is necessary, and there are plenty of people around in plenty of different areas that can help this happen. So rather than seeing it as like putting your hands up and admitting defeat, it's not about admitting defeat, it's about admitting the world has moved on and our minds are being opened. So I think, in a long about way, I just want to say that I hope that in 10 years time, like, difference is everywhere, and accepted everywhere, I think, is the key.
I would agree, and hopefully my takeaway there is that hopefully we wouldn't be having to have this conversation first and foremost in 10 years from now. That would be good progress. Thank you so much for your insights and your time, and I could continue speaking all night, but people seem to only be able to consume X amount of minutes of content one night, so I'll have to switch us off and then we can carry on the conversation. But thank you, and I think a really good takeaway just on the topic of allyship is to circle back to your point, Lauren, around blind spots and speaking, and you all spoke about just being aware of, being conscious of speaking and giving the opportunity and a voice to people who maybe are in your blind spot. So that's a nice takeaway for people, I think. James?
Yeah, if I could just add something which I wanted to say in relation to allyship, and not just talk theoretically, is just anyone who's listening and who's watching, just choose to challenge and understand the role that plays as what an ally is. You know, understand appropriate intervention and how to go about that, how to recognize microaggressions in the workplace, and how to have that conversation. But equally, on the flip side, if you have been challenged, how to react. You know, do not react, defensively. Just say, "Oh, thank you so much, I wasn't aware." Because very rarely mistakes are done in malice, but your reaction to the challenge also says a lot. So, I just say that people challenge people if you do hear language, or you hear something, or you see something that you think's wrong, give that feedback. And then if you are on the receiving end, just to say that, "Thank you so much, I wasn't aware." And then everyone's going to be in a good environment actually to learn.
That's a really, really good point, James, and a great one to finish on. So thank you. Thank you all so much for your time, and really appreciate your insights.